So people used to ask me what kind of artist I am. What kind of art do I create? Well, for several years I was a graphic designer, and they would challenge me on whether computer art would be a form of art. But if you say to them, I'm a painter, well, suddenly they become much more impressed. And over the ages, painting has become the epitome of art. So we're going to talk about painting in this chapter. It's an important chapter in that a lot, like I said, a lot of the work considers painting the foremost type of artwork. So let's talk about what paint is made from. We have a pigment, which is the powder, compounded with a medium. And the medium is a liquid that holds the pigment together. It can also include a binder, and the binder is an ingredient that ensures the paint will adhere to the surface. It is applied to a support. A support is the surface in which the artist works. Ground or primer is a preliminary coating. Now we call it gesso. Griselle is a painting technique executed in grayscale values before adding color glazes. And glazes are thin, translucent layers of color. Media and medium are also used to refer to all the materials used in a work of art. With a caustic painting, pigment is mixed with wax and resin and burned in as a heat source passes over the surface. The luminosity in this image is a direct result of the media. Though painted in 100 to 100 CE, this durable media looks almost as fresh as when it was painted. This image is a funeral portrait created in Egypt during the time of the Roman rule. These portraits were actually buried with the mummified remains, which helped to preserve them. Compare the traditional usage of this medium with Jasper John's collage on canvas, which was overlaid in a caustic. His contemporary approach reflects the fascination with mass printing in the neo-dada movement, which we discussed later on in the semester. Fresco is pigment mixed with water and applied to a plaster support, usually a wall or ceiling done in plaster. This media requires careful planning and hard physical labor. The artist works in very small areas at a time, as the plaster must be worked at a proper degree of dampness. A cartoon, like a full-size sketch, is transferred with pinprick holes. Then usually charcoal is rubbed into these holes, leaving dotted lines for reference. Mistakes require chipping away the plaster, sanding, and starting from scratch. You may already know that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome. And if we have time, we're going to see a movie later in the semester called The Agony and the Ecstasy, which chronicles this point in Michelangelo's life. This work is absolutely a huge fresco. After you're done with this PowerPoint, I'm going to ask you to watch a video, and you'll exactly see how frescoes are done and are made, and how it is so not an easy task. But here we see a fresco painting by Raphael, and you should remember this painting. Michelangelo and Raphael were unspoken rivals. Both were painting frescoes commissioned by the Pope in the Vatican. Raphael's work in the Vatican stance, the Pope's library, was open to those who wanted to see it, which is where the painting, the School of Athens, is located. While Michelangelo left strict orders that no visitors were allowed in the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo, feeling consumed by the daunting task, apparently had little interest in Raphael's work. But Raphael had a lot of interest in his, and said to have paid an aid secretly to visit the Pope to view Michelangelo's ceiling in progress. And so profoundly did it affect him that he returned to his work, where he proceeded to pay tribute to Michelangelo by incorporating him in the foreground of this masterpiece fresco, the School of Athens. It is believed that Michelangelo is the seated figure here, who is forward in the painting and his head resting on his arm. This important painting depicts Plato and Aristotle with their followers and students. Notice the linear perspective used in the painting, and notice how the vanishing point is strategically placed between Plato and Aristotle. This work, 26 by 18-foot fresco, represents the Renaissance ideals of beauty, perfection, naturalism, and intellect. Probably the other two most famous frescoes in the world are the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel that inspired Raphael's tribute of Michelangelo, and Da Vinci's Last Supper. Please remember them both, as well as the School by Athens by Raphael, for your test. Frescoes were repopularized in Mexico during the 20th century. Remember that. This artist is the husband of Frida Kahlo. Remember, you saw one of her paintings, Two Fridas, when you read about symmetry in your text. And I showed you some of her drawing examples at the start of chapter 6. Diego Rivera's Mixtec culture depicts the history of his Mexican culture. It celebrates the glory of Mexico's ancestral civilizations, the political struggles of Mexico, and the hopes for its future. Here we see a peaceful community of artists at work, while their nobles are being fitted with ritual costumes. Another example that has really vibrant, dark colors is Rivera's Carnival of Mexican Life Dictatorship. If you ever make it to Falling Waters, pay attention to the artwork or ask about the artwork on the wall. There is a Rivera in one of the bedrooms there. And there was a great movie made in 2002 about Frida Kahlo, starring Selma Hayek and Alfred Molina as Diego Rivera. Remember, we have discussed 4 artists who have created important fresco paintings: Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael, and Diego Rivera. Tempera is a medium like watercolor with the durability of oil paint. It has been made with several kinds of emulsions, but the most common and with the most lasting effects is egg yolk. Traditionally, tempera is painted on wood with a ground of gesso, which is a white pigment with glue. A huge advantage to tempera is that it retains its brilliance and clarity, and it doesn't yellow like oil. It dries quickly, and the forms can be built up quickly. Because it dries so quickly, blending must be done very rapidly. Usually, artists build up the layers of hatching, cross-hatching, and textural strokes. The master of Osservanza has built up forms on his work slowly through layers of small, precise brushstrokes. There are 8 panels in this series. Here you see 3 of them. They depict episodes in the life of St. Anthony Abbot. What would you call the work that is done in 3 panels? If you guessed triptych, you guessed right. Jacob Lawrence, a 20th century artist who worked with tempera, is definitely influenced by the expressional power of abstraction. Looking at the painting cabinet maker, you can see the simplified flat forms. What style of painting have we seen before that resembles the style that we see here in the cabinet maker? Can you see some Cubist influence in his work? Jacob Lawrence's style is more rough than some tempera paintings, but when you know his story and understand that he was trying to say in his work, the Migration series, you understand how this rough style fits his work. One of America's best and highly respected African American artists, Jacob Lawrence records and commemorates the African American migration beginning around 1910 from the south to the north. These three images on the right are three panels of the Migration series. You can take a look at the whole Migration series in a link in our chapter folder. Several years ago, this whole series was purchased and exhibited at the Phillips Gallery in Washington, D.C. It has been said that Jan van Eyck invented oil paints, and while we know now that this is not so, he is attributing with mastering this medium. In fact, he is the first artist we credit with mastering oil painting. Oil paint is comprised of a pigment combined most often with linseed oil. The slow drying time has its advantages in that glazes, layers of thin translucent color, can be added or reworked indefinitely. Multiple layers can be applied without the danger of cracking. The problem is that drying time can take weeks or even months, which, if you need to make major changes, can be really difficult, and making meeting deadlines even more difficult. We have seen work by Jan van Eyck before. He was the artist who painted Arnolfini's double portrait. And remember, Arnolfini's double portrait, we discussed this painting when we talked about iconography and symbolism in artwork. Often artists began with a black and white study called a grisaille, over which colored glazes were then added. A more spontaneous method is called alla prima, or all in one go. In this first image by Ingres, it is easy to see how it could have begun with a grisaille coating. The colors in this image almost glow. The satin of the cloth really pops because of the underlying layers of the paint glazes. You can't see the brush strokes because the glazes are so thin. Using a glaze allows the oil painting to dry more quickly, so the glazes can be applied over a few days. In contrast, this oil painting by Morisot allows us to see the brush strokes. In fact, you feel pretty sure the intent of the artist is for the brush strokes to be part of the experience. She has used the paint in an impasto way, applying it thickly to the canvas. Her work is part of the Impressionist style. She just gives the impression of the cloth. It isn't painted with the same care we see in the work by Ingres. The styles of these artworks are very different. What artists have we seen that has allowed us to see their brushwork so clearly? As an art student, I spent a lot of time in the oil studio, and probably one of the most distinctive smells that I remember is the oil paint. You know those smells that evoke memories, like your grandma's cookies or the Christmas tree, the real one that you used to have as a kid? Well, for me, oil paint is one of the greatest nostalgic senses I have. And I hope you can feel the love of the medium in both these artworks. One gives us a feeling of an impressionist painting, but we try to decipher the meaning. Maybe it is a landscape, maybe it's a garden, But either way, we know the artist has explored and enjoyed just the process of putting the paint on the canvas. In the second image, we get to see joy in using the medium. Each of these shapes are made of wood and covered with canvas and resemble in an almost cartoon-like that image. You can make out eyes and lips and possibly some other parts of a figure. The shapes themselves form the frame, if you will, around the piece. When you see all these oil paintings put together, you see them in a timeline, if you will, as when they were created. I hope you notice the progression in style and the use of the paint. Their use of paint is just as varied as their style and subjects. In this watercolor painting by Sargent, it contains many layers of transparent washes. The white of the paper is used to produce the light values, as white opaque watercolor is rarely used. While the brush work can be spontaneous, preliminary value studies must be thorough. An artist cannot erase or reclaim white areas. Like the foam in this rushing stream, once color has been laid over that white paper, you can't get a white again unless you would use an opaque white paint on it. I find watercolor very unforgiving. You must think about the highlights before you start to paint, because leaving the paper white creates the highlights. With oil or acrylic, you can add the highlights afterwards. Also, each color affects those laid over them due to their transparency. For example, a blue wash placed on top of a yellow will take on a green hue. Watercolor is pigment with a medium of water and gum arabic that acts as a binder. Preparing the paper can take time. For the best results, the paper is soaked in water and then stretched using a paper tape onto a wooden board. Once it dries, it will not buckle when using the water on the paper with the paint. There are new, very thick watercolor papers available now that do not have to be soaked and stretched, but many watercolorists think this paper doesn't allow for the same transparency in the color as a stretch paper. Watercolor is easy to use from a portability standpoint, just your paints, water, and your paper. But it does take a lot of practice and a lot of skill. Watercolorists have many varied styles, techniques, and subjects as oil paintings. Gouache is an expensive version of traditional elementary school paints. It dries quickly, which is good for painting with young children. It does chip off easily if it's applied too thickly. Gouache can be applied in translucent washes, but artists usually take advantage of their opaque quality, enabling them to layer even white over black. It is especially suited for large, flat areas of color. This Cuban painter, Wilfredo Lam, exploits both of these possibilities in this technique. There are human and animal forms in this fanciful painting. This image contains references to Santeria, the Caribbean region that combines West Africa and Roman Catholic beliefs. I am particularly taken with the full range of values and overlapping in this image. You really get a sense of depth when looking at this painting. Synthetic polymer paint, better known as acrylic paint, was perfected in the 1950s. Acrylics are weatherproof, strong, yet flexible. They can be thinned with watercolor effects or used straight from the tube for impasto techniques. They can be cleaned with water, which is so eco-friendly compared to oil paints, but the look and paint very differently than oil paints. An advantage is that they dry relatively fast, and the disadvantage is that they dry relatively fast. Depending on what technique you're using, this can be a blessing or a curse. If you are trying to blend colors together, then the dry rate may be a problem. But if you are looking to paint more flat-looking images, the quick dry factor could be a good thing. David Hockney uses acrylic in 2 different ways here in this painting, Mount Fuji. In the background, he puts the paint on in a wash technique, and on the vase and flower in the foreground, he uses an impasto technique. Collage is a French word for pasting or gluing, and refers to the practice of attaching actual objects to the surface. It could be on canvas, on paper, or another surface like wood. Pablo Picasso was the first to use this technique. His friend, Georges Braque, picked up on this innovation, and they worked closely together. In the end, it was Picasso who received all the credit, though. In collage, objects are not transformed or interpreted through paint, but they're physically present, a concept that shocked the art world in the early 20th century. We see a bit of newspaper here, some sheet music, wood grain fabric, and wallpaper combined to create a fragmented still life. What style of art are these collages? If you said Cubism, you would be right. Romare Bearden carried on this technique, but worked with bits of photographic magazine illustrations to evoke his life as an African American growing up in rural North Carolina. We saw earlier that he also used his neighborhood New York City as aspiration as well in his work. His technique reminds us of quilting and the improvisational nature of jazz, both of which have African roots. Above this is a recurring symbol in Bearden's work, a train. Bearden said, "A train was always something that could take you away and could also bring you to where you were. And in the little towns, it's the black people who live near the trains." A new kind of collage is being created on the computer. These images are called composite artworks. They are created in photo imaging software like Photoshop and combine photographic images and drawn images, scanned objects, or drawn graphics composited together on a computer. Carrie McDowell's image is an example of this new technique. But it also has its roots in traditional collage. Contemporary artists have not only pushed paint media and style, but also the concept of a painting as an object to be framed or hung on the wall. They are blurring 2- and 3-dimensional concepts. Matthew Ritchie's non-objective drawings and paintings cross between 2 and 3 dimensions. His works on sintra, a thin plastic that is easily bent, so he can allow his painting to cascade from the wall to the floor. When asked about the meaning behind his work, he replied, "Life is as complicated as it appears." So what came first, the chicken or the egg, the idea or the medium? I expect that there is reason to think that ideas of what to paint and draw have led to artists finding ways to portray them. And I expect the artists have found new mediums which spur ideas of what they want to do with it. I also suppose it doesn't matter, as long as the artists continue to explore their ideas and ways to express them. And that concludes our chapter.